The state of Iowa in the year 1912 was the heartland of America in every sense of the word. It was a place of rolling cornfields, tight-knit communities, and unwavering faith in the simple virtues of hard work, family, and neighborly trust. Towns like Villisca, nestled in the southwestern corner of the state, were microcosms of this ideal. With a population of around 2,500 souls, it was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, children played safely in the streets until dusk, and everyone knew everyone else's business. The town's name, derived from a local Native American word, was said to mean pretty place. But in the early hours of June 10, 1912, a darkness descended upon Villisca that would forever sever its identity from that idyllic meaning, etching its name into the annals of American crime as a synonym for unspeakable evil. The central figures in this tragedy were the Moore family. Josiah Joe Moore, aged 43, was a successful and well-liked businessman. He had worked for 7 years in the farm equipment sales business for a local magnate named Frank Jones before branching out on his own, taking the lucrative John Deere contract with him, a move that, while savvy, reportedly bred deep-seated resentment in his former employer. Joe's wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, 39, was the picture of pious devotion. She was actively involved in the local Presbyterian church, organizing events and playing the piano for services. Together, they were raising 4 children: Herman, aged 11, Catherine, aged 10, Boyd, aged 7, and Paul, aged 5. They were a family emblematic of the American dream, prosperous, respected, and deeply embedded in the fabric of their community. The evening of Sunday, June 9, 1912, was a special one in Villisca. The Presbyterian Church was holding its annual Children's Day celebration, an end-of-year event for the Sunday school that Sarah Moore had helped coordinate. The church was full that night, the air buzzing with the excited energy of children and the proud warmth of their parents. The Moore family was in attendance, and with them were 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, aged 12 and 8, friends of Catherine Moore who had been invited for a sleepover. The service, filled with short speeches, recitations, and hymns performed by the children, concluded at approximately 9:30 in the evening. The Moore party, all 8 of them, walked the short distance from the church to their white frame house at 500 East 2nd Street, arriving home between 1:45 and 10 o'clock. The house itself was a modest but comfortable structure. Built in 1868, it had no electricity and no running water, a common feature of the time. Kerosene lamps provided light, and a pump in the yard supplied water. That night, the family likely enjoyed a late snack of cookies and milk before preparing for bed. The routine was undoubtedly normal, filled with the quiet chatter of children after a thrilling evening. There was no sense of impending doom, no foreboding that would have caused Joe Moore to bolt the door or check the locks. In Villisca, in 1912, such precautions were simply not part of the daily rhythm of life. The back door was almost certainly left unlocked. As the 8 occupants of the house settled into their beds, a figure moved in the darkness outside. The killer, whether one man or more, approached the silent home. He may have hidden earlier in the barn, peering through a knothole to observe the family's return, leaving an imprint in the hay. Perhaps he had already entered the house and concealed himself in the attic, where 2 spent cigarettes would later be found, suggesting a long, patient wait. He knew the layout. He knew his targets were asleep, and he was armed with the family's own axe, taken from the barn or a shed. The attack was methodical and brutal beyond comprehension. Sometime between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning, the killer began his grisly work. He first targeted the master bedroom, where Joe and Sarah Moore slept. Using the blade of the axe on Joe and the blunt end on Sarah, he bludgeoned them to death with such ferocity that the weapon gouged the ceiling above their bed. Josiah Moore suffered the most extreme violence. His face was hacked beyond recognition, his eyes completely destroyed by at least 30 separate blows. He had been attacked with hatred that seemed personal, a rage that far exceeded what was necessary to kill a sleeping man.
The killer then moved down the hall to the children's room. Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul were all murdered in their sleep, each struck multiple times in the head with the blunt end of the axe. There was no struggle. They never had a chance to wake up. The killer then returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows on the already dead Elder Moores, knocking over a shoe that had filled with blood from the initial assault. Finally, he descended the stairs to the first-floor guest bedroom, where the Stillinger sisters slept. Here, the only hint of resistance was found. Lena Stillinger, the 12-year-old, appeared to have wakened. Her body was found lying crosswise on the bed, and she had a defensive wound on her arm, suggesting she had raised it to protect herself from the onslaught. She and her sister Ina were killed. Seemingly after the murders were complete, the killer engaged in a series of bizarre, ritualistic acts that would become the defining and most mysterious aspect of the crime. He covered the faces and heads of all the victims with bedclothes and articles of clothing pulled from dressers. He went through each room of the house and covered every mirror and window with cloth, towels, and blankets, draping the home in a shroud of darkness and reflectionless silence. A kerosene lamp was found at the foot of the beds in both the master bedroom and the guest room, each with its glass chimney removed and the wick turned down to provide only the faintest ghost of light. In the kitchen, a bowl of water was found, swirled with blood, indicating the killer had paused to wash his hands. A plate of uneaten food was on the table. Most strangely of all, a 4-pound slab of raw bacon taken from the icebox was found on the floor, wrapped in a dish towel or placed near the axe. The murder weapon itself, now wiped partially clean, was left leaning against the wall in the guest room where the Stillinger sisters lay. Having completed his horrific task, the killer locked the door from the inside and left through a window, disappearing into the Iowa night as silently as he had arrived. The following morning, the profound silence of the Moore house aroused the concern of a neighbor, Mary Peckham. By 7:30, she noticed no one had emerged to do chores, the animals were untended, and the house was eerily still. After receiving no answer to her knocks, she alerted Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, a local druggist. He arrived with his own key, unlocked the front door, and entered. His screams moments later confirmed Mary Peckham's deepest fears. He had found the bodies of the Stillinger girls. The local marshal, Henry or Hank Horton, was summoned. His search of the house revealed the full, stomach-churning scope of the atrocity. "Someone murdered in every bed," he reported. What happened next would irrevocably compromise any chance of a successful investigation. The tight-knit community of Villisca, upon hearing the central telephone office's all-call alert about the murders, descended upon the Moore house in a state of collective shock and morbid curiosity. A macabre circus ensued. The sheriff was unable to gain control for hours. Hundreds of townspeople traipsed through the blood-spattered crime scene, staring at the bodies, handling the murder weapon, and contaminating every potential piece of evidence. In a final grotesque act of violation, some individuals even stole fragments of Josiah Moore's shattered skull as souvenirs. The scene was so thoroughly destroyed by the time the county coroner, Dr. Lindquist, and county attorney Ratcliffe could secure it with the help of the National Guard that any hope of finding a clear forensic trail was lost before the investigation could even properly begin. The mystery of Villisca is a black hole in American history, a puzzle with pieces that have been lost to time and trampled by a crowd. If you're drawn to the darkest enigmas of the past, ensure you don't miss our deep dive into the suspects and the botched investigation that followed. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to join us as we unravel the threads of this century-old nightmare. The truth, as always, is more terrifying than any fiction. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery of the 8 bodies, the town of Villisca was plunged into a paroxysm of fear and paranoia. The idyllic trust that had defined small-town life evaporated overnight. Locks sold out across the country. Families purchased firearms for the first time and organized night watches, their eyes scanning the darkness for a monster they could not comprehend. The funerals for the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters were held on June 12, 1912, and were attended by thousands, a somber procession of grief and terror that required the National Guard to close roads for the hearses and the caravan of over 50 carriages that followed them to the Villisca cemetery. The question on everyone's lips was the same: who could have done this?
The initial suspect pool was a reflection of the town's desperation. Every transient and stranger in the area was looked upon with intense suspicion. One such man was Andrew Sawyer, who was interrogated after neighbors noted his obsessive behavior following the murders. He was known to sleep fully clothed with an axe by his bed, as if expecting to need a quick getaway. However, without evidence, he was released. The investigation, led by local authorities and soon involving state agents and private detectives, quickly began to focus on 2 primary suspects, each representing a very different theory of the crime: a local grudge or the work of a wandering madman. The first major suspect was Frank F. Jones, Josiah Moore's former employer and the wealthiest, most powerful man in the county. The bad blood between the two was well known. Moore had not only left Jones's employ, but had taken the valuable John Deere franchise with him, establishing a direct and successful competitor. There were also whispers, though never proven, that Joe Moore might have been having an affair with Jones's son-in-law. The theory posited that Jones, a former state senator with considerable influence, had hired a hitman to eliminate his business rival and his entire family. This theory provided a motive that the community could understand, a violence born of greed and revenge. However, despite intense speculation and the clear presence of a motive, no concrete evidence ever emerged to connect Jones or any hired assassin to the crime. His wealth and political influence likely shielded him from the most aggressive forms of interrogation, and the case against him remained circumstantial and ultimately faded. The second and most compelling suspect was a man who embodied the concept of the wandering madman, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly. An English-born traveling Presbyterian minister, Kelly was a profoundly peculiar figure. He had a history of mental instability, having suffered a nervous breakdown as an adolescent. As an adult, he was accused of voyeurism and of asking young women and girls to pose nude for him. His journey to America in 1904 had been marked by a trail of financial mismanagement and bizarre behavior across Methodist and Presbyterian churches in several states. He was in Villisca on the night of the murder, having arrived to participate in the very Children's Day service the Moore family attended. Witnesses placed him at the church, watching the family intently. Reverend Kelly's behavior after the murders was instantly suspicious. He left Villisca on the 5:19 a.m. train on June 10th, hours before the bodies were discovered. Yet he told fellow passengers on the train that there were 8 dead souls back in Villisca, murdered in their beds as they slept. In the weeks and months that followed, he developed a disturbing obsession with the case, writing long, rambling letters to investigators, the county attorney, and even family members of the victims, pleading for details and offering his own theories. He returned to Villisca weeks later, and impersonating an investigator, managed to gain access to the still vacant murder house to join an official inspection team. His letters and actions were so erratic that authorities initially dismissed him as a mentally unwell eccentric. However, by 1914, their opinion changed. Kelly was arrested in Washington, D.C. for sending obscene material through the mail. He had been sexually harassing a woman who applied for a job as his secretary. This landed him in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, the National Mental Hospital. His continued fixation on the Villisca murders now seemed far more sinister to investigators.
In 1917, he was formally arrested for the murders. After a lengthy and reportedly brutal interrogation, Kelly signed a detailed confession. He claimed a demon had commanded him to commit the acts. However, he almost immediately recanted, stating the confession had been coerced by police brutality. Kelly was tried twice for the murders. His first trial in 1917 ended in a hung jury. The second trial, held in 1918, resulted in a full acquittal. The juries found the confession unreliable, and the case against him, while compelling on a behavioral level, was entirely circumstantial. There was no physical evidence placing him in the house. Furthermore, the prevalent sentiment of the era, a deep-seated reluctance to believe an ordained minister was capable of such grotesque violence, undoubtedly played a role in his acquittal.
He was a strange and troubled man, but the state failed to prove he was a murderer. Other suspects emerged over the years, each adding a layer of complexity to the mystery. William Mansfield, a man whose own family had been victims of a similar axe murder in Colorado, was briefly considered. A drifter named Henry Lee Moore, no relation, was also investigated due to a spree of axe murders around the same time, but his alibi held. Another compelling theory was presented decades later by authors Bill James and Rachel McCarthy James in their book The Man from the Train. They posited the murders were the work of a prolific unknown serial killer who traveled the country via railway, targeting families in isolated homes with near-identical methods: the use of an axe, the covering of mirrors and victims, and the taking of a small souvenir. They pointed to a string of similar family axe murders across the Midwest between 1911 and 1912 in Colorado Springs, Monmouth, Illinois, and Paola, Kansas, as evidence of a single mobile predator. Their prime suspect was a German immigrant drifter and logger named Paul Mueller, who was believed to have committed similar crimes and had a fetish for covering mirrors. However, like all theories, it remained speculative, unable to be proven conclusively. The investigation was doomed from the start by the catastrophic contamination of the crime scene. The bloodhounds brought in to track the killer were useless after hundreds of people had trampled the property. They led a massive crowd of 2,000 on a chaotic chase to the Nottoway River before losing the scent. Key pieces of evidence, the handled axe, the moved bodies, the stolen bone fragments, were rendered meaningless. The 2 spent cigarettes in the attic, the slab of bacon, the bloody water in the bowl, these clues became mere curiosities rather than keys to unlocking the truth. Without modern forensic science like fingerprinting or blood type analysis, which were in their infancy, the case relied on witness testimony and circumstantial patterns, none of which was enough to convict any of the viable suspects. The case grew cold, leaving a permanent wound on the town and a question mark hanging over American justice.
The Moore House on East 2nd Street stood empty for decades, a silent, boarded-up monument to the horror that had occurred within its walls. It was a place of dread, a wound in the heart of Villisca that refused to heal. Life in the town moved on, but it was forever altered. The population dwindled over the following century, the shadow of the axe murders acting as a persistent, chilling whisper from the past. The house itself, however, refused to be forgotten. It found a new, unsettling purpose in the late 20th century, transforming from an abandoned crime scene into one of America's most infamous haunted attractions and a permanent shrine to an unsolved mystery. In the 1990s, the house was purchased by historians Darwin and Martha Lynn. They undertook a painstaking and expensive restoration, returning the structure to its exact condition on the night of June 9, 1912. They removed modern additions, replicated the period-appropriate wallpaper and furnishings, and, most notably, ensured the house had no electricity or running water, preserving the authentic, eerie atmosphere of the time. Their work was so meticulous and historically significant that the Josiah B. Moore House was added to the National Registry of Historic Places. It was no longer just a murder house. It was a historical artifact, frozen in time. The Lynns opened the home to the public, offering daytime tours and, most famously, overnight stays. The Villisca Axe Murder House became a magnet for curiosity seekers, true crime enthusiasts, and paranormal investigators from around the world. Visitors reported a wide range of unexplained phenomena within its walls: disembodied whispers and children's laughter, cold spots that defied explanation, doors opening and closing on their own, and the feeling of being watched or touched by unseen hands. Some claim to hear the sound of heavy breathing or the distinct thud of an axe strike. The house's reputation as one of the most haunted places in America was sealed. The attraction leans into its macabre history. Visitors are encouraged to sign the rafters in the barn, leaving behind messages that range from respectful memorials to the chillingly creepy, like the infamous warning, "Don't stand on your head in the kids' room." The tour guides, deeply knowledgeable about the case's every detail, lead visitors through the cramped rooms, narrating the sequence of events and the various theories. The experience is described as profoundly powerful and unsettling, a direct connection to a past tragedy that feels palpably present.
Secondly, the case is an enduring criminal enigma. It is a locked room mystery on a grand scale, with countless questions that have never been satisfactorily answered. Why were the mirrors covered? What was the significance of the slab of bacon? Was the killer left-handed, as some inferred from the blood spatter patterns? Was the violence directed specifically at Josiah Moore, or was the entire family simply collateral damage for a disturbed mind? The suspects are all flawed and imperfect fits. Frank Jones had motive, but no evidence. Reverend Kelly had opportunity and bizarre behavior, but his confession was unreliable and the juries acquitted him. The theory of a serial killer like Paul Mueller is compelling in its pattern recognition, but remains ultimately unprovable. Finally, Villisca represents a cultural phenomenon. It is a cornerstone of American true crime, a story that has been told and retold in books, podcasts, documentaries, and articles for over a century. It fascinates because it combines the wholesome, all-American ideal of a small town and a happy family with the absolute antithesis of that ideal: random, unimaginable violence. It holds a dark mirror to our society, reminding us that evil can penetrate the most secure and seemingly peaceful of places. The house itself is a physical manifestation of this paradox, a quaint white farmhouse that holds within it a bottomless well of darkness. The town of Villisca itself has had to grapple with this notoriety. For some, the museum is a necessary act of preservation and a way to control the narrative. For others, it is a perpetual reopening of an old wound, a commercialization of a local tragedy. Yet the stream of visitors never ceases. They come to pay their respects, to seek a thrill, to feel the connection to history, or to try and solve the puzzle for themselves. Over a century later, the questions remain. The case is cold, but the interest is hotter than ever. The victims, Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, Paul, Lena, and Ina, are forever trapped in that June night, their story forever unfinished because their killer was never called to account.
The Villisca Axe murder house stands as the only remaining witness, its secrets locked within its walls, continuing to whisper to those who dare to listen. The story of Villisca is a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some mysteries are meant to linger, haunting us across the decades. If you are compelled by the unresolved, by the space where history and mystery collide, then our channel is for you. Subscribe now and ring the bell for notifications. We are just getting started on our journey into America's darkest historical chapters.